So thank you, Ellen, for the invitation to speak to you all today at the ATLAS Institute. I've heard a lot about your place for several years, and so it's super exciting to get the chance to show some of the work that we're doing at Georgia Tech, and hopefully hear about the projects that are going on over there in Colorado. So my name is Grace Leslie. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Music at Georgia Tech. And I like to call this talk Inner Rhythms, Music Technologies Informed by the Brain and Body. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more in a short while. So at Georgia Tech, I direct the Brain Music Lab, which is a lab that I started when I joined 2.5 years ago. And we're really focused on kind of developing this whole research infrastructure that you see here, where we take all different kinds of sensors, consumer grade sensors, research grade sensors, medical sensors, interfacing those with technology that's designed to combine several different kinds of data streams together, recorded audio, brain and body signals, movement, and so forth. We then store this data on servers and analyze it. But I think our main focus in recent years has been developing ways to stream this data in real time to music and audio software so that we can then kind of close this feedback loop that you see here and develop ways to turn this data into music to then in turn influence our users' cognitive or affective state. And that's really going to be the focus of this talk today, is kind of what happens at these different stages in that process. Oh, and by the way, if any of you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt. I'd love to kind of explain what's going on here more if anybody is interested at any point. So I promised I would explain the title a little bit better. I'm really inspired by the work of Edgar Varese, who wrote, this is in 1933, he wrote, "I dream of instruments obedient to my thought and with which their contribution of a whole new world of unsuspected sounds will lend themselves to the exigencies of my inner rhythm." So he was a real towering figure in early 20th century American experimental music. And for him, this idea of using technology to create new kinds of sounds meant doing things like, playing with electronic tape and creating electronic music, or having percussionists play sirens in an orchestra. But you can see that there's these seeds of this thought that with new technology, we can create a more seamless transition from thoughts that are in a composer's head to the actual sound that's created. So my answer to this quote, coming from almost 100 years later, would be that now that we have technology that allows us to actually read information about what somebody, a performer or composer, is experiencing, why don't we actually use this technology to then play out that inner rhythm in the music itself? So I'll give an example of one case in which I've done that. Can you hear this? So I'm talking about developing this whole new kind of human-computer interfacing for creating music that involves recording brain and body signals from a music listener or a music performer, and then developing a software layer that in which the aim is to measure or classify something about the state that that person is experiencing at that time. And then we can develop another software layer that will take that information about what we have classified or what we have estimated about the person's internal state, and then use that to influence a algorithmic composition or other kind of real-time music software. And if we can kind of imagine how this closes this whole feedback loop here, because when the performer or music listener is then hearing the results of this music that is being created by this process, you can in turn influence what they are experiencing at that time. I think that all of the work that I've really done in the last 10 years is focused on various stages of this feedback loop, but together I'm trying to construct a more detailed model of how this process works. And really, this research is made possible by an observation that I think was made several decades ago, that brain waves in particular, and music acoustic waves operate on a mathematical level very similarly. And for me as a student, doing this kind of research was made possible for me because I first started out, learning about audio digital signal processing. And then when I found myself in a computational neuroscience lab, about 8 years after that, I realized that all of that math was exactly the same. We're just working with, basically music that is a whole lot slower. So as an example here, on the left here, we have a spectrogram of Alvin Berg's violin concerto. And then on the right here, we have a spectrogram of the EEG from somebody that is opening and closing their eyes. And so I'm wondering if anybody in the audience might be able to point out a couple of things that are similar between these two sets of data that we have here.
It almost looks like you can see overtones in the neural data.
Yeah. So that's Torin who is speaking?
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah. So Torin, from the electric guitar, I'm guessing is a music person. So he was referring to these overtones here that are something that you would always expect to see in an audio spectrogram. And this is because any particular music note that we hear, we actually, register in the brain as that being a note at this particular frequency, but any really naturally, naturally sounding sound is going to have all of these overtones that are at integer multiples of that particular sound. So this is a shape that we see a whole lot when we're looking at acoustic signals. But yeah, on the right here, you can see actually that there's an overtone. So when somebody opens and closes their eyes, we have something happening in the alpha range in occipital cortex. The alpha signal, very simplistically, we can kind of describe it as a lights out signal that is used to, turn off functioning in certain parts of the brain. And so when we close the eyes, the brain is actually releasing a signal to shut down occipital cortex, or basically ignore processing or input to that area. And so we can actually see that when the eyes close, we see this burst of alpha activity here, but then we also see that at twice a range up here as well. If this is centered around 10 hertz and this is centered around 20 hertz. So from a frequency point of view, we can see how there's things that are similar in the structures here. I would also say that from the temporal point of view, we can actually extract what the rhythm is of this piece by looking at what is happening along a vertical striation here. And we can also see that here on the right as well. So anyway, this kind of observation that we can really treat these two kinds of signals in very similar ways has really influenced a lot of the way that I approach this particular HCI problem. So, a first foray into this was really focusing on just this stage here. How can we take EEG input of somebody who is listening to a musical excerpt and becoming very engaged emotionally in it? And how can we attempt to classify what emotional state they might be experiencing at that time? So this was actually during my PhD research under Scott McCaig. And I actually found when I looked at people who were moving expressively to music, these were actually film music samples that were chosen to have very strong emotional impacts. So very sad music or very angry music. And I had them actually imagine that they had a friend in the next room who was deaf and who couldn't hear the music, but really longed to experience it. And I said that they would be able to communicate what they were feeling from this music to their friend by moving this white dot along that screen that you see here. This is because I had gotten very familiar with a lot of emotion research that depended on listener self-report, people really reporting that they're feeling happy, reporting that they're feeling sad. And for a number of reasons, I felt that this approach was limiting when it came to trying to measure something about music engagement. And so I felt that actually turning this into a communication task rather than a self-report task would actually work a little bit better. So what I found from this experiment was that there was a burst of that alpha activity that preceded each one of these kind of expressive swings that they took. And that burst was located in the right temporal parietal junction, which is kind of known as being the seat of theory of mind, which really supports an ability to be able to extend oneself into somebody else's mind, being able to figure out what is going on inside a observer's head, for instance. And so this actually only happened when people were emotionally engaged in what they were doing and not when they were completing a kind of dual mathematical task. And so I posited that this theory of mind area was actually very important in supporting this kind of emotional communication task. And this idea of communicating something to somebody was a very important part of this idea of creating a expressive, engaging performance. So along the way, I became interested in adapting those techniques of being able to measure something about what somebody is experiencing, but then take those measurements and use those to influence software that will create music and sound. So one of the first projects that we worked on was called Mood Mixer. And this was back in 2010 when the first kind of consumer Bluetooth EEG headsets were coming on the market. So this is a little bit dated now. You can see that these headsets have a single channel on the forehead and they're kind of integrated into this bulky headset. But my colleague Tim Mullen and I hacked these, figured out how to measure a index calculation that is based on ratios of certain EEG frequency bands. So for instance, the amount of alpha activity that they have relative to the other bands that might indicate a meditative mood, or the amount of beta, the beta minus theta over the rest of the power might indicate how focused they are. And that was really built on observations that we had made in the lab. And what we actually did was created a collaborative interface where two people in a kind of community art installation mode could wear these headsets and then influence a 4-channel musical mix using their thoughts. So I'm going to play a video from way back when. Let's see if this will work.
Focused and less relaxed.
Other studies are looking at how it can improve language learning, the ability to read, and also alter mood.
Right now, I'm controlling the music with my mind. So if I'm relaxed, the music is calm and soothing. But if I become agitated and focused, then the music becomes correspondingly animated. The idea is that if I can control the music with my thoughts, then a change in music can alter my mood in return.
So anyway, that was 11 years ago now, which is hard to believe. So the performance that you all saw at the beginning of this talk was actually the moment when I adapted very similar software to this to the idea of going on stage and performing using my own EEG signal. So that was really, taking this idea again of me going on stage now, recording EEG in real time or online, and then making some kind of estimation or classification of what my current state is at that time, and then using that to synthesize a musical mix. And the particular video that I played for you is a really interesting example. It was, I think, the second time I had ever played this, but also the most technologically complicated performance I had ever done in terms of, it was at this really fancy venue in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I had just moved to start a postdoc at the Media Lab, and they had like 5 people on robot dollies taking video and all of these guys doing audio, which I was always used to like lugging all of my own audio equipment all the time. So that was new for me. And I actually got stage fright for the first time, since I was like 14 years old. And, so my lip started to quiver, which is something in this quiet music is really going to have a huge impact on that. And I really thought that I had, trained myself out of that completely. But you can imagine that I had built in the studio this whole set of software that was dependent on me creating these moments of like Zen-like calm when I was on stage. And that, was all calibrated to me in the lab. And then I went on stage and it was actually very different. I had to reprogram and recalibrate things during the performance itself so that I could regain some kind of expressive bandwidth over that. So that was a real lesson for me. It was also a indication that I think as an artist that there was something, that there was more work to be done with that. I think that there was something that was very unsatisfying as an artist about going on stage, attempting this very expressive thing. There's a lot of theater involved in telling people that you're going to be playing with your brain waves. And there's a story that just inherently tells about you kind of revealing what's truly inside of you and what you're truly feeling. When in fact, I think the way that this was happening with the technology, that story was not actually true in a way. I was basically going on stage and comparing myself to a version of myself in the lab and testing how successful I was at recreating, lab me when I'm actually stage me. And what I was interested in doing was figuring out a way instead to go on stage and be able to feel like I can actually perform a representation of my experience at that time. So in order to do that, I basically had to take away this processing stage, I felt. Or this was, in reality, this was one of the experiments that I ended up doing that seemed to work out for me very well in terms of trying to recapture the spontaneity of on-stage experience for me. So in order to do that, I had to develop a way to take that incoming EEG stream and then convert that directly into sound. So, basically developing a sonification algorithm that will, in an online fashion, take this incoming EEG stream and use that to, alter sound that is stored on the hard drive or synthesize new sound. Oh, I thought I had another slide that I could show you. Okay, so anyway, that actually resulted in a brand new kind of brain-body music performance for me. What ended up happening is I kind of entered this stage of about a year of needing to practice using this algorithm as a new kind of music instrument. It was very similar to if I had found a violin on the side of the road and picked it up and needed to learn what are the sounds that it can create, what do I do in order to get different sounds to come out of this. And when you think that it takes 15 years to learn how to play the violin, there's probably still a lot more work that I can do using this new instrument. But here's an example of what this sounds like. Different. So this is just a quick plug for my Bandcamp page where you can stream all of this for free. So please check that out. But, I think I'll just kind of summarize that part of the talk by saying that, I think that this is an example of something that really satisfies me as an electronic music composer, where it's something that developing the new technology actually did create this synergy with a new kind of music sound that ended up coming out of that. And it was just very satisfying to me as a music technology researcher to kind of experience how the music changed very dramatically because of the affordances of that particular software and hardware setup. So one example of that is you can see that the music is very static, and it actually takes a lot of time for the music to have a kind of expressive arc. And that happens because of what I am actually able to do when I'm on stage. It takes me a long time to make the kinds of changes that I need to make in order to make those sound shifts happen. And so, so as a composer, I think that that was just something that I finally felt like I was happy with the way that the technology interacted with the sound itself from that. So this is kind of the next stage of this talk, where I try to talk about all of the practical applications that I'm starting to explore with this work. In my time at Dartmouth, I met an epileptologist who told me about early on in his training, when they were still using analog EEG traces in the hospital while patients were having seizures. You could actually tell when that was happening because of the sound of the pens clanking against the casing, right? And so he was kind of telling me, well, I actually learned to, detect patient seizures from a sound. And so maybe there's something about this algorithm that you're using on stage that we could try out in the hospital itself. So we applied the same algorithm that I was performing with, which is basically just taking real-time, incoming EEG signal and either stored sound samples, in this case, in the performance case of stored flute samples or voice samples, or sounds that are captured during the live performance itself, performing a convolution of the sound with the incoming EEG, and then taking, so this is, I'm kind of showing a frequency domain implementation of this, but we're basically, smashing together two spectra here. So what you end up getting out of this is the EEG spectra is kind of smashed together with that sound spectrum there. And what we found was that when we played these sounds to people, that they were actually able to detect things in those sonified seizure moments that they were not actually able to detect using the visual traces. So this was an example of a case where this kind of technique might actually be useful someday, although doctors are pretty much mostly trained to diagnose these in a visual readout of the data. So I don't know how soon this would actually be adopted. So one exciting new area that I've been working on for the last few years is a concept where that focuses on this part of that feedback loop here, which is can we engineer new kinds of music sounds that are designed to elicit very specific brain rhythms or body rhythms. So, with my colleagues at Dartmouth, Barbara Yobst and Robert Kwan, we developed a series of musical stimuli. They're kind of quasi-musical acoustic stimuli that are designed to sound at this, frequency crossover in this in this kind of narrow frequency band where we have brain activity that we can measure at that band, but also acoustic activity as well. So this is kind of in that mid gamma range. And we actually found that when we played these sounds to our patients, we saw for the patients who would normally exhibit really high numbers of this type of micro seizure called an IED, that actually would cause the number of IEDs in that trial to go down. And I'm going to give an example of what this kind of sounds like. So this was unfortunately the most musical sounding one that we were able to create. And it does help to have a subwoofer when you're listening to this, because this is very low frequency. So this was actually inspired by work that was going on across the street from me while I was at MIT in Li Hui Sai's lab, where they were actually putting mice who were bred to have certain biomarkers of Alzheimer's in these chambers that were flickering at 40 hertz. And what they found actually that this kind of sensory neurostimulation caused these Alzheimer's biomarkers to go away. And so now they've actually started a few companies investigating this as a human Alzheimer's approach. And I'm actually working with Annabelle Singer, who is now on the faculty at Georgia Tech, but who was a postdoc in that lab. So we're trying to see if this maybe could be used in a human Alzheimer's disease context as well. So during that time in Boston, I also collaborated with Roz Picard and Asma Ganaharyun to see if there's a way that we could compose music to influence the way that people breathe as well. And so this is just, one more example of that part of that feedback loop, where we're basically introducing a piece of music technology that is really designed to elicit a particular brain or body rhythm that we know is going to be beneficial for that person. So this is an example of a music composition that's designed to really subtly breathe. So I'm going to play this for you, and you can see if this actually slows your breathing down while you're listening to it. So there's this kind of amplitude envelope that is undulating over time. There's a lot of research that shows that 6 breaths per minute is a real optimal pace, but that's actually slower than what most of us are actually breathing at, especially when we're stressed out or focused on our work. So we actually designed an experiment where we were testing 3 different kinds of interaction. One where people were actually wearing a breathing device, and we altered the way that this breathed along with their own breathing. We then had a interaction paradigm where we measured what their baseline breathing rate was, and then played this slightly lower than their natural rate. And then we did one that was just fixed at 6 per minute. So that would be the equivalent of putting on a CD of spa music, for instance, for them. So what we found actually was that so all of the interventions slow down their breathing. But the one that did the most was the personalized tempo. So this was the one where we had measured what their natural breathing rate is, and we tried to kind of subtly influence them to nudge that down. For me, as a music technologist, this was a really exciting result because it showed that the CD of spa music here didn't work as well. So this is a way that, you know, we can justify going through the lengths of trying to personalize these interventions using the technology. Interestingly, we also saw this kind of cascade of effects with their galvanic skin response, their EEG, and also their heart rate as well. So this was something that actually, you know, turned out to be a very meaningful intervention. So lastly, I'd like to show about, you know, some very exciting research by my PhD student, Mike Winters, who was studying playing heartbeats to people. So this is kind of the third example that I'm showing there here about trying to produce some kind of sonic stimulus that is going to have a beneficial effect for somebody. So as part of this demonstration, I want to ask you if these are two people that in which you're able to hear their heartbeats, and I'm going to play them for you shortly. Which of these are somebody that you would want to have a cup of coffee with, for instance? So I'm going to play, this is person A on the left here. So this is candidate A. So what can you infer about his personality or emotion state from listening to this heartbeat? And I'm going to play it again. Okay, and then let's play person B now. Someone once said, well, person B already drank all of the coffee. But that's a good answer. So, but what can we infer about these two people, and, you know, which one of them is, you know, maybe in a more peaceful state? And why would we infer that? Anybody have a guess?
Well, slow equals calm.
Right.
It seems too simplistic, though.
It is pretty simplistic. However, there's a really neat twist on this experiment that my student pursued that I want to tell you about. So he was interested in seeing if playing these heartbeats for people would actually have an effect on the way they can empathize with others. So he combined a test that's very similar to what I just showed you with this very classic test called reading the mind in the eyes, in which you're given a photo of an actor who is, you know, playing out a particular emotion, and you're asked to identify what that person is feeling. So, you know, Mike divided these trials into two questions. One that was designed to measure cognitive empathy, which is this idea of you being able to actually identify what that person is feeling, and then a more a kind of emotional convergence question, which is really about you know, not only are you able to identify what that person is feeling, but do you actually feel that feeling inside yourself as well, as a result of seeing that person express it. So he played, you know, different versions of these stimuli with the heartbeat sounds alone, the heartbeat sounds combined with the visual stimulus, visual only, and then visual, audio-visual combined. And he had two cases, one where it was, he basically had stimuli where it was a congruent match. So for instance, a very happy set of eyes with a really fast heartbeat, or incongruent ones. So what he found was that the cognitive empathy was changed. If you compared the visual only with the audio visual, when you added the audio, they actually changed their cognitive empathy answers more. And then also the presence of the heartbeats increased their affective empathy score. So this is how often they would report that they were really sharing in that person's feeling. And when the heartbeat was incongruent with the visual stimulus, that actually changed it more. And also when the heartbeat was congruent, they would actually match their feeling more to the other person. We also found that their heartbeat would basically slow down in reaction to hearing the slow heartbeats. And you would actually see this heart rate shift that would happen over the 25 seconds of that trial, but the heart rate shift was stronger in people who were in those trials that they were reporting high amounts of empathy. So there's a lot of ways that we were actually able to show that that this empathic experience was actually tied to the physiology of how your body experiences this kind of sound. We actually recorded EEG as well. And we looked at this heartbeat evoked potential, which is kind of an index of what they call interoception, which is how much you are paying attention to your own body state at that time. And we found that in the higher empathy trials, we saw a smaller HEP, ERP in that signal, which basically told us that those high empathy moments indicated that you were paying attention less to your own body and perhaps more to the other person's body as well. So this is, the most exciting result that we've come upon in the last few years, I think. In conclusion, I just want to, thank all of the people that I worked with on this work. And I hope I've kind of showed that, in my response to Verez, that I would say that I think that it's important not only to use this kind of technology to increase the number of sounds that we have available to us as composers, but also start to bring people well-being as well during this process. So thank you. And I think we have 10 minutes left. So does anybody have any questions? Oh, am I supposed to look? Maybe I'm supposed to look at the chat window, perhaps. Here, I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, so there's a couple of.
No, that's all right. I can.
Oh, don't have any questions. Okay.
No, I mean, as I was jotting down my questions, it just kind of seemed to be interesting and evolving because the beginning prose that you put forward was, trying to express the music that one hears within, right? So like that can come in many forms. Obviously, like one can have all sorts of elaborate internal representations of music. But then when you were saying that when you were performing, that it was kind of internally reversed on you, where you were playing your brain like an instrument. It seems like a dualistic process, almost like you're trying to like meet in this middle ground and understand perception and action in this way that seems much deeper. And well, I forgot to say thank you, and that I really thought that everything that you did was incredible. But to kind of like bring that point together, I really just wonder how you feel about where things are headed, the trajectories, and like what excites you about like exploring that space between like that performative aspect of playing your brain and being able to perform your thoughts.
Yeah. Thank you, by the way. That was very nice of you to say that. I think that what excites me is, really, if we were to turn back to that interoception idea, I think that just because of the limitations of the science and the technology, these kinds of N=1 performative experiments are something that I've only been able to do with just myself on stage. And that was what was very natural to me because of the kind of music performer that I was and the kind of music that I was interested in doing. But actually, from a scientific standpoint, I think the most exciting thing to study is the way that this is really a communication between two humans, and how we're seeing as an example that this affective response, responding to somebody's emotion, really has to do with this interoceptive process. And so it's really impossible to create a model for this kind of music or human computer music interaction that is really just about one person. I think it really has to do with communication between two people. And so that's what kind of excites me the most is maybe looking at these paradigms, these social affective neuroscience paradigms a little bit more closely to try to develop a model for music interaction. That was a little vague, but I hope that that answered your question.
It was a general question. I appreciate your answer.
Grace, really cool stuff. Thank you. So just to extend this a little bit, some of us in the past year or so have been interested in Torin and I and Ellen and others. We're looking at interactions of ensembles of musicians and non-musicians and what the communication is. And of course, the musical examples you provided were kind of slow moving, but we were interested in like strong rhythmic, strong harmonic things. And of course, that makes this whole problem much more complicated. But I think the fertile ground here is, how do musicians improvise together? How do they communicate? What is going on? And I hadn't thought about brain waves and heartbeats and other physiological things that might also synchronize. So something fun for us to look into. And if you're
really
looking for collaborators, we're kind of fatally intrigued by this problem.
Very cool. I'd love to talk more about that.
All right.
Well, I guess it would be interesting. I mean, following on what Wayne said, right? If a whole bunch of us jam together, and how much in sync we are in our brainwave or in our heartbeat.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's like having coffee, right? After you have coffee, I literally can feel the heartbeat goes faster after I have coffee. That's why I don't drink coffee. Yeah, and then the fact that music could also change the brain, that part is also fascinating. So back and forth, both the input and output, right? I think that's what Torin was trying to ask. The brain playing what the thinking out, and or having that has an effect, like, yeah, the feedback loop. Fascinating.
Yeah, I think that, so you're talking about these two different examples there. And that first one that you mentioned of people all synchronizing together. I mean, I think that, music was actually a technology that was invented in order to get people to synchronize together and to share a common experience. And I think that just as we understand that on a deeper scientific level, that's when I think we can start to try to harness that for these very specific clinical examples.
Now, you should have gone to Africa with Bela Fleck when he was looking for the origins of the banjo. And there's this one scene I loved. He comes to this village where at the end of the workday, all of the men come to this common instrument, which is a bunch of sort of tuned rocks. And a family owns a rock, and that man teaches his son the rhythm. So at the end of the day, they're banging on this thing, creating this enormous composition, right? Well, a memorized thing. And then their children are on small rocks learning to mimic it. And like, oh, wow, this is cool, end of the day ritual. But what possibly could go on between these men who have been working in the fields all day, are very synchronized in their work, now synchronized in music? What else is going on physiologically? And does that inform them as to create this music? And how much was it memorized and how much was improv? We don't really know. The focus was, oh, Bela Fleck says, that sounds cool. And his banjo happens to be tuned to the scale we have. Yeah, a little bit. But I don't know if you saw that movie, but
No, I didn't.
Throw down your heart and, just look at that and say,
I'll have to check that out.
What is going on there? And this is such an integrated part of this community's life that it's not an accident that they do this, right? This is what goes on. So what can we learn from it? I don't know. Bring some more instrumentation.
When I was at Dartmouth, I had a senior colleague there who was a ethnomusicologist who specialized in Central Asia. And he had actually, he was talking about an example of, this was actually Northern Africa, where he was very interested in cultures that have a trance tradition. And, this was one case where they were called guzzles, I think. And, they would kind of do this, a repetitive movement. We were thinking about writing a grant in order to take some EEG data there. But then I got my current job, so I couldn't do that. But, that would have been something that would have been so fascinating, because I do think that these cultures developed these, synchronized musical practices as a kind of technology to, share in a kind of common experience there. And so we have a lot to learn from those practices.
I mean, the fascinating thing here is, most of the Western world considers music to be this commercial enterprise. You perform, you become popular, you exchange shiny objects over it. And we've created the idea of the performer and the audience and the passive audience. And it troubles me.
That's a very, very new concept,
Exactly.
But in some ways, maybe the new technology that we have is going to return us back to a case where, music doesn't necessarily have to be something that we're, passively consuming, but rather something that we can make together.
Absolutely. Very hopeful. Of course, the other side is if a series of low frequency pulses can calm you down to prevent epilepsy, could a big truck full of giant speakers inject sound to do really bad things to people, right? So, yeah, scary. Sorry. I always love this. Certain non-traditional therapies always result in goodness, but well, what if you stuck the acupuncture needle in the wrong place? Doesn't that cause your head to pop off or something? So
yeah,
apparently
I
not.
guess the best science, has two sides to the coin, I guess.
It's funny
so
that
much to learn.
The word like in harmony or in sync, right? Or on the beat, or use that to indicate how things work. And I always imagine all my body are in harmony, working each other. So if I can hear the sound, I should know, okay, I need to do more exercise on my hand, or my feet is not working stably or something. So yes, I want to see more how the music is part of a human being and how that affects you both in and out. Yeah. Thank you. It's just wonderful.
Thank you.
Just the question. So your department is part of the music school or part of engineering or both or music?
College of
We have
Design.
a School of Music. We've had a music technology there for a music technology program for, I think, 15 years now.
Okay.
We have a master's program, a PhD program, and we just started a bachelor's of science program about 3 years ago.
Interesting.
So there's actually, we have a lot of students. We have about 40 master's students at a time, I believe.
No, that's cool. I mean, we've been talking about where this belongs on CU Boulder, and you know, of course, it belongs in ATLAS, but the music school thinks maybe not, and they already have music tech programs, but they're teaching how to use music tech, not create new tech, right? So certainly the answer is collaboration, right? Because you want engineers and musicians and poets and anthropologists and God knows what else to collaborate on this, right? And,
that's actually that's actually like a big question that I think a lot of programs have. And, I think that the Georgia Tech program is pretty unique in that we're really, really focusing on the creation of new technology and stuff that's like 10 or 15 years in the future. So there's actually a lot of things that music technology programs do that we actually don't do in our program because we're really focusing on developing the new kind of technology.
Well, the music technology program was established in the College of Design and used to be College of Architecture due to the previous dean, Thomas Galloway. And he has the foresight saying when there are people from architecture, industrial design, building construction, and when people retire, he took the position and said, we need to have a music technology program. And he used that line to create this because there's no art and science.
I
There's
didn't know
art
that
and
about that
science, there's no
story.
music. And just the original band and the chorus program music was like looking for a home. And there's engineering, right? And then there's media, and then the architecture. Architecture say, hey, music, architecture is frozen music. We were happy to take music a part of the college. So that was like 25 years ago. So yeah, I watched that happen. I said, what a person with great vision about, it's part of design. That's why the cafe is called Galloway Cafe in the building.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Thomas Galloway, the Galloway.
Okay.
Yes. I have a lot of respect for that person. Okay, I'm going to dash out because I'm late for my faculty meeting. Bye.
Very nice to meet you, Alan.
Thanks, Grace.
Thank
Good
you
luck.
for coming to the talk.
Hope we stay in touch. Thanks.
Yeah,
Cool.
definitely.
All right.
Does anybody else have any other questions, or are we gonna?
I did have one more question. Yeah. So, okay. Where I sort of struggle with understanding expression and perception and internal representations and things like that is as a musician myself, I find there are like 3 states that I mentally am in when I'm composing or performing or having a musical experience. And my question is, I wonder if what I say resonates with you and what state you're trying to capture for the representation of the music. And okay, so I'll just explain my own experience, which is 1, sometimes when I go to sleep right before bed, like right before I'm about to knock out, I can hear very vivid music. And I've heard this reported from like Oliver Sacks, the neuroscientist, and a few other accounts, like I think Robert Jourdain's book had something like that in there. And the idea is just that you can basically, in certain states, hallucinate very vivid music. And that's one form of an internal representation. Another form is kind of like when music gets stuck in your head and it's just kind of just like bouncing around in there. And I use that kind of form to compose. So often what I'm doing is I'm just kind of like spinning an idea in my head and then I'm playing with it and then it kind of evolves and I capture some and that process comes together to build something greater. And then there's the improvisational mindset where I have no idea what's coming next. I'm not trying to do anything and I'm just rolling with the punches. And I feel like those states of mind are very starkly different and would require a different approach for each one. And I wonder if that does that resonate with you at all? Like how do you approach that?
That's a really interesting way of kind of breaking things down. I think that first one sounds like a hypnagogic state. I don't know if that's what Oliver Sacks called it, but
He called it an auditory hallucination, and sometimes people could have visual hallucinations.
It's usually like when you're falling asleep or waking up, I think. So
or
it's almost
losing
like
brain.
Or what?
Losing brain.
Or losing brain.
Yeah,
so
like part of
it's kind of like where you don't have, it's like your prefrontal cortex is either shutting down or just starting up. And so you're conscious, but you don't have that kind of executive control, which is kind of like a waking dream, if you have experienced those as well.
Not as explicitly.
It's like similar to that. But that's something that I wouldn't expect to be experiencing like when I'm performing on stage, for instance, because that's probably a case. But I do think that there's elements of this, of like trance-like music states where that's what's happening, is you're kind of entering a hypnagogic state in a way, and you're kind of shutting down that. I mean, this is all conjecture and based on like describing subjective experience. So I'll have to put, that a disclaimer out there.
Always noise.
That it, just from a subjective description of what it feels like to be on stage and in a trance-like state, I would say that must be pretty similar to that first state that you're describing. And that maybe, I think, part of these cultural practices that we were talking about are really about entering a state like that. There's a really amazing book by Judith Becker called Deep Listeners. It's not about Pauline Oliveros's work, although she probably mentions her, but it's more about, she kind of uses these ethnomusicological examples, but also combines that with the neuroscience research to talk about these kind of deep music listening states. And I think those would be examples of where that first state that you described might actually be able to be experienced in a conscious like state where you're not sleeping. And I think that that's kind of a state where that's kind of the goal for these cultures, is to create that, because then it, it creates this experience that people give, spiritual importance to, or also experiences where people feel very connected to each other. So there's a very cultural level of importance to that. And then number two was like the earworms that you're talking about. And so that's something where it's almost like an anxiety mechanism. I think I remember Diana Deutsch was actually researching these, and she was finding that there's like a correlation between like, maybe states that were associated with anxiety and hearing these, because it's very similar to, any other state where you can't really control where your attention is going. And in a more calm state, you might be able to tune that out, whereas you can't. So I guess I personally can't think of an example where my practice was like, impacted by that. Because when I experience earworms, it's usually like really annoying music from commercials and not necessarily like my own music. And then the third one is like, I think that really the thing that I'm, as a composer, the thing that I'm most interested in is that interaction between state 1 and state 3. Because I find that there's something very important about like getting to a state 1 in order to be able to do what you're describing in state 3. And that's something that Pauline Oliveros wrote a whole lot about in her work. And in her deep listening practice, she really wrote a lot about getting to this state of like immediacy with the sound, and a state where the body and the sound were very closely aligned in order to be able to play along with other people in a more connected way.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And she, just before her death, she published an article that was really, it was actually a book chapter where she was talking about, I'm blanking on the name. It's the French scientist who studied the motor potential that you see in the brain before somebody creates a action. I think it's Labat. And she was kind of using that vein of research that, you know, that scientist had used that as an example of how we don't actually have free will. And he had made a argument on that, but she was kind of contextualizing her own music experience in terms of that scientific topic, and was kind of describing how, in a way, her approach to music improvisation was a really subconscious and like body-based thing, and something that was not, involving a whole lot of, cortical processing. So that's
totally.
very much about meeting of state 1 and state 3. You kind of have to reach like a hypnagogic state in order to be able to like truly improvise.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's like there's a couple of things that come to mind. One is like a flow state and what that means in regards to being able to put yourself in a position where maybe you've got a bunch of subconscious material that you've memorized and are trying to express. But I think more explicitly regarding the kind of body communication component, there's something I've been really fascinated by, which is just like intra action. So like what is influencing you by what's occurring, like when you're actually touching something, the feel of it, the resulting sound, and the feedback loop that occurs between you and instrument, or you and process, sound and action. And I wonder to some extent like how influenced one is, like you might have like a pre-thought, and then how influenced one is by the environment or by other people or by all those other factors that play into musical expression that we're not thinking about beyond just the initial thought. And I wonder if that's similar, or if that's just.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting and fertile place to explore, not only on a scientific level, but on a musical one as well. I'm curious, are you doing any kind of music compositions that are designed to study this?
I wish. No, I build mostly technologies and stuff to help try to represent music in a way. So I kind of do the opposite work you're doing, but have the same goal, in that I work on things that help like communicate with what maybe like our deep intentions might be or something, creating interfaces that work better for us or easier, specifically for novices, those who have very intense representations and not a whole lot of time practicing and skills, and how that influences your internal representation, and ultimately how it influences what you're able to create and what you think of that creation and that kind of a thing. So that's kind of where my interests are.
That's like a really, really interesting area of research. I'm really fascinated by, like in the music interfaces community, there's kind of like a debate, I would say right now, about making, when we're trying to make accessible devices, are we actually just kind of programming all the creativity into that? And in making that accessible to people, are we actually kind of like hindering them to be truly expressive,
Right.
Versus, creating a technology that actually takes a lot longer for people to learn, but in the end might have more expressive bandwidth. I think I was like trying to touch on that debate in my talk when I was comparing these two stages of the brain music performance, because I was kind of moving from one to the other in that saying, like, I think that in the end, the reason why the violin is such an expressive instrument is because it takes 15 years to learn.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of like this really interesting component, was just like your interaction temporal or longitudinally over time influencing the actual representation that you have. Like that is the creation of the representation, is more of your experience rather than like whatever's happening right now or what have you. And toying with that, as well as just like, well, what is the real difference between what's going on in your head and what's going on in my head, and where can we come to a fertile ground on that kind of exploration is very interesting.
Well,
Really
it seems like
appreciate
really
it.
cool research that you're doing. Is that within the music department?
Actually, I work for Ellen,
Okay.
and I've actually met your student Mike before. We
Oh,
had a
yeah. Oh,
chance to
cool.
chat. Yeah, and I was when I was looking at Georgia Tech, and
Okay.
your program's fascinating. Everything you're doing is really awesome, and I'd say that there's an interesting amount that Atlas here is trying to do that's similar to that, and it's part of like where I fall is like music
Well,
and
cool.
technology and fun.
Yeah, maybe there's a way that our two programs can, work together eventually. I'm always up for collaborations.
Oh, awesome. Well, yeah. Well, I can reach out to Alan, or we can find a way to connect and hopefully come to something.
Sounds good.
Perfect.
It
Well,
was nice to meet everybody. I don't know if Brody is still there, but I actually have to go meet with a student now. So
I
I'm gonna
assume,
sign
no
off.
worries. I really appreciate your time, Grace. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.